The title for this came up about 5 years ago in a conversation at the International Council of Tanners, when we were looking back to the 1960s, who one or two of this room might remember, and thinking about issues like apartheid and Vietnam and secret files that were causing a lot of disquiet in society. And then 3 relatively tranquil decades, and we move into the 21st century, and we have terrorism to worry about. We have Iraq and Afghanistan worrying about genetic engineering. We have the whole issue of climate change, and we began to realize that these germ cells of discomfort that kept you awake at night, that made you wake up unhappy or worried in the morning, just a little bit uncertain, were back again, and particularly relevant for a body like us, as uncertainty as to where you go to find real, honest science. Can you trust the science which is being published? Can you trust the people who are telling you the facts that you are expected to develop your life and your business upon? And of course, in this last few months, we've had to add to this the crisis in banking and rapid inflation, making our whole life and society much more complicated. Now, one or two of you from Scotland will know about a chap called Adam Smith, who always made the point that you don't get your bread in the morning because of the benevolence of your baker. You get your bread in the morning because of his selfish pursuit of profit. And this was the thought, which of course is worrying us a little bit now when we think of some of the high bonuses in the city, but this was the thought which was the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was an excellent time for us all, except that at the time of Industrial Revolution, where you have to admire the invention and the creativity and the development that came from it, you have to also recognize that they at that time considered that the world had an infinite supply of raw materials, and that man's activity was such that it didn't matter if he polluted the land, the sea, the rivers, and the air with his activities. And so just as we heard in the Proctor lecture earlier this morning, when we started on our chrome tanning, the industry, which was run by very well-minded people at the time, had no real conception of the potential damage that chromium in effluent might do. What you actually had at that stage was a development of what we would call the production concept, when, as Mr. Ford got us going, things were widely available and really cheap, and people liked that. Then we moved to the product concept, where engineers made things and made them excellent and innovated, and they assumed that their customers would be really pleased to have them. And that's the leather industry as I knew it when I joined. All these tanners that used to say, the consumer will buy the product that I make. My leather sells itself, and there's no need for sales, and there's no need for marketing, which is so much changed now. We then moved to the selling concept, where we sold like crazy through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And we put a big American concept and persuaded consumers to buy. And the consumers purchased because of the power of selling, not quite sure what they would get. That's the concept that we still use in politics these days, particularly in American politics, where very rarely in American politics do the candidates deliver once they're in office on what they promised during their campaigns. Then we subsequently moved to what we call the marketing concept, where businesses begin to make things that customers actually need, talk to customers and listen to customers and develop product with customers in mind. And that's more where we are today. And added to that, we have what we call the societal marketing concept, where we have added a social conscience to it, because we recognize that when we make things that satisfy people's needs, other people in the way through are impacted, and they have to be considered, from employees through to local communities and many, many others. And that brings us to a concept that I think was first raised here in these rooms at an SLTC conference about 10 years ago, of the 3 E's: effluent, environment, and ethics. And of course, ethics are quite a difficult thing to define because they evolve over time. They're quite distinct from legal rules. And as you can see with topless men and topless women, over time views of society changes and different cultures have different views. So it's a very difficult thing to define, but it's not necessarily something which we can ignore. And beyond that, things can be ethical and legal, but they can also be ethical and illegal. And so you can get something like gazumping here, which is, I think you would agree, unethical, but it's quite legal. But leaking documents and being a whistleblower, in some circumstances, you'd consider to be ethical, although it might very well be illegal. So yes, we're definitely playing here with quite a minefield when we look at ethics overall. Now we have a choice here, in as much as when you're dealing with all of the ethical and legal issues that the leather industry has to deal with, you can choose to be defensive. And we tend not to think about the leather industry as being perhaps relevant in all this. But in fact, we're deeply involved in all these sectors. Now, if you take the defensive side, think about big oil or think about tobacco, lobbying like crazy and denying that they cause any issues to society whatsoever. You can also be reactive. And that's when you deny everything and you make it very clear that there's absolutely nothing wrong with what you're doing in your industry, but when you get caught out, you change very rapidly in order to survive. You can be accommodating, which is more what companies like McDonald's and others do, which when they start seeing a problem on the horizon, they very quickly react and start to introduce things that might avoid problems coming up. Or you can be proactive. And the problem that I've had, and why it's useful to be able to raise it in a meeting like this, is that my view has always been that the leather industry has to be proactive, that we have a responsibility to be proactive and not to hide. And with the ICT, when we were having this discussion a few years ago, they were very concerned about the dangers of being proactive. And they considered that raising the profile of the leather industry and raising these issues would create more problems from the leather industry than it would solve. But you have to be then considering where that leaves the industry and who is actually taking the decisions. Because we do have a lot of problems inside the leather industry related to our raw material, related to our chemicals, and related to our effluent. Now, if you think just on the raw material side, what raw materials are we using now and what raw materials are we going to use in the future? If you take the 20th century and look at the herds of animals that existed in the world, particularly cattle, which is our primary raw material, the ratio of cattle population to human population has remained remarkably stable all during the 20th century. Quite a remarkable figure when you actually look at it. We don't now believe that there's enough land in the world left for this to continue. Cattle use too much land, and where you begin to look at the countries in the developing world that are pushing forward the eating of red meat, which is important for us, they're struggling to find enough land on which to keep the cattle. China is putting land aside at the moment to make sure it's reserved for grain production. It's trying to stop dramatic over far too much urban development. It's trying to slow down golf course development. It's very typical considering our location today, because it knows that we're short of land on which to keep growing the herds with populations. It's also been interesting that all during the 20th century, the proportion of leather made per capita has remained about the same. And we're hoping that that will continue in the future. But it does mean, of course, that now you'll often find in Chengdu and Sichuan, for example, pigs, which are major provision of meat in the developing world, are grown in 5 and 6 and 7-story buildings now. They're industrialized and mechanized. There are big changes happening. As a consequence, we're actually of a mind that things like camel, things like yak, things like kangaroo, their hides and skins are going to be much more important. And then, of course, we immediately come up against the pressure groups as to decide what is an appropriate raw material for our industry and what is not. And there are some unexpected consequences you need to think about here. The Inuits, Canada, are not allowed to take the seals in the way which they've done for 1,000, 1,500 years. And we accepted, in the main, the activities of the pressure group to ban the culling of seals in Canada. The outcome of that was, of course, that 45,000 Inuit were made unemployed, that a lot of the fabric of their life broke down. The environmental work, which they did coincidentally because of their nomadic way of life and in checking the forests as they traveled through it, they stop as they move into urban centres. They've become susceptible to Western diseases such as diabetes. And of course, lately, when the big oil companies wanted to go in and oil the shale, and the pressure groups which had pushed them to stop killing the seals, said to them, well, you've got to make sure now we don't damage your environment by extracting all this oil shale. The Inuit said, well, I'm very sorry, we're all unemployed, we want this work, we're going to welcome this oil industry here. So the pressure groups are now uncomfortable with what they've done. But I think we also know, as a group, that actually we need to take a much more realistic and a much more objective view as to what skins are right to produce and what are not right to produce. From kangaroo through seals, seals not just in Canada but also in in Greenland, and that we as an industry need to be interested in animal welfare, but not necessarily promoting 100% and solely animal rights. There are very big issues here. We go into chemicals, which were mentioned in much more detail this morning in the Proctor lecture, about the fact that we use some difficult chemicals, the fact that we have some banned substances, but we don't have agreement across industry as to what those should be, that we have some difficult and complex testing of those, some of which are quite controversial and hard to use. And then when we get to waste, however we think of ourselves in an industry, we do throw away 50% of what we put in, which is an amazing wastage percentage in terms of wastewater, in terms of solids, and in terms of atmospheric pollution. So we have to start thinking as we move through all of our value chain and everything that we do, what is the correct ethical and legal position that the leather industry should adopt. And I would say in this that there is a need for us to be proactive, because by being inactive and hiding in the past, we have accelerated the fact that the power of decision-making in our value chain has gone to our customers. And we consequently only do what our customers, the brands and the retailers, tell us, and they often take expedient decision based on no science or bad science, because we don't have a voice. And if someone's throwing red paint over your store in the main street of an American city, it's easier to back down and say, okay, I won't use Indian hides in my leather making at all, than it is to say, well, actually, that's not a valid approach. We need to help India sort out its abattoirs. And anyway, if we try and ban Indian hides, we know very well what happens. That they import one container of Indonesian hides, which look much the same, and continue tanning the Indian hides. And how are you able to identify the fact that you're getting Indian or Indonesian hides? It puts all sorts of irrelevance and problems into the into the system. And so when we're looking at all this, there's one big point that we do know, which is that marketeers have a tremendous power to create buyer value and to shape the markets. We also know in our industry that too many of our marketeers do not know enough about the leather that they are selling and promoting. And that if we are going to work on the basis of sound science and good science, we have to stop them making some of the false claims related to organic leather and leather tanned only with natural materials, telling us that chromium is bad when we know that in some circumstances, properly used, as we heard this morning, chromium is one of our best tannages. When we consider, which is one of the work we're doing in this new Leather Futures research group in Northampton, when we start to look at the holistic value of one tannage against another, that you have to actually consider not what happens to the leather in use, but what happens to that leather when the article that it has been used for is finished with. What happens to a pair of shoes? What happens to a leather bag? And then the question, which was beginning to arise in the session just before lunch on upholstery, is to what is the appropriate lifetime of a product? And one takes one's thinking away from cradle to grave, more to cradle to cradle. The difficulty with what we've done, still adopting the Industrial Revolution approach and hiding from our responsibility as tanners to be proactive in the ethical and legal environmental situation, is not to actually dig in to what are we actually doing. How long should a tannage last? Can we correctly consider that everything should continue to go to landfill? If we put all of chromium leather into landfill saying it's safe, then that chromium can never be extracted to be reused again. So how many years do we have left of chromium? And yet we know very well that the technology exists to extract chromium from the final product. We just haven't got it commercially viable yet. But would that not be worthwhile doing? And would that not actually be environmentally better than throwing more and more finished products into landfill at the end of life, saying to ourselves, oh well, don't worry, we know it's safe. Now, at the moment, companies like Nike in their all-terrain division have got a system whereby when shoes are handed in at end of life, they strip off the sole and it's reused, and they strip off the upper. But the upper, they're grinding up and using in running tracks and tracks for sports fields and things. And of course, that stuff is in there, and it's very nice use for old material, but the chromium is still there, and the chromium will never ever be able to be removed. And there is an argument, if you follow the cradle-to-cradle thought, which Nike are looking at very hard right now, that says, well, reuse, reducing reduction and recycling is good, but it's not necessarily right. And if it's wrong, and we're doing it perfectly, then what we're doing is actually perfectly wrong. And Nike are trying to see, well, we're doing this with the best intention, but how can we actually stop this one-way use of material that takes an item like chrome, just as we're doing with so many other chemicals, copper, which is very short of, and which I understand we're mining out of landfill now, for one-way use, and using it entirely up. How can we bring it back into the system? So this is the work that we've initiated in the Leather Futures Research Group in Northampton. We have the first PhD student working on some of these things starting early next year. But there is another way in which I'd like to encourage the SLTC to get deeply involved in this. And this is through the new Liaison and Communications Council, which has been set up in the IULTCS with Mark Palacier as chairman. And some of you may know that in September of 2007, the IULTCS put together a group of all the interested participants in the world in a forum in Paris and looked hard at how they could start to write the positioning papers that are sound for the leather industry, and that will actually give us a definitive position that we can all live with and all shape and all argue to when it comes to talking to brands about chromium in leather, about waste disposal in the industry, about the future of tanning, about the type of raw material that we ought to use, rather than ducking down and hiding in what we know is a fragmented industry, primarily populated by very small or medium-sized businesses who haven't got the strength to fight against the brands and are ending up acquiescing to some things in the processing which they actually believe to be wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Can I invite some questions from the floor?
Mike, I understand where you're coming from, and I agree with a lot of what you say about being proactive to make sure that what we do doesn't impact on the environment. It is an interesting thing, though, as far as chromium is concerned, that the amount of chromium we use in the leather industry is a very, very small proportion of all the chromium that's mined. Because a lot of the chromium that's mined goes to things like the metal industry. And so they have a problem too. I'd just like to make that point. Yes, we should do something in our industry.
Yeah. You can make exactly the same point when you go to textiles, though. Because when you go into something like polyester, which is a defining textile, it's only using about 1% of the oil in the world. So you can go through time and time again and say, "Oh, we're so small to be irrelevant. We should be left around." But I do think we can, in terms of chromium, we can raise the quality of the debate, and I do think that's exactly what Dr. Germ did at 10 o'clock this morning. He put some real facts on the table, and we can go forward and honestly use those facts and say, "This is the status of the chromium tanning situation at the moment." And if you begin to start to look at the advertising, go down to Linear Pelli in 4 weeks, and see all these tanneries marketing organic leather made only with natural materials, you really get frightened that this is irresponsible marketing, and it's not appropriate for our business. That's really the position I'm making, and I don't think it matters that we're small. I think we're dealing with the motor car industry, the big brands. I think it's important that we behave properly.
I just want to put it in context.
Sorry. Can you get that up?
Some more? Any more? No.
Is this something that the leather industry is doing by itself with Nike and people like that, or are other industries doing it as well?
No, Nike effectively are doing it directly with the cradle-to-cradle people, and but they're struggling in leather. And I actually believe the cradle-to-cradle people have an entirely wrong view of the leather industry and need to be redirected. So I think we do need to get involved. I think the cradle-to-cradle people have an absolute hatred of chromium that is illogical and irrational. But Nike at the moment are struggling in what to do. This particular group in particular have the very best intentions. And I think there are a lot of issues about Nike as a company. But in this area, there's a group that definitely has the very best of intentions and are struggling. What are actually the solutions? They understand the problem. And if you look at footwear and the solvents and the making, there's some very difficult chemicals used in the whole manufacture of footwear, and it's quite a big concern. I was talking about it with Echo. They had their plant opening in Xiamen last week, where they got the tannery in the shoe factory, and it's all really state of the art and things. And we were just looking, because they have this ability to control from the rawhide through to the store and the shop. We're trying to just work out how can you start looking at these things in a more proactive way. And they were proactive with PETA when they tried to stop the use of Indian skips, because ECHO said, no, we're going to carry on, but we will invest some money in trying to improve some of the slaughterhouse. And PETA accepted that, as far as I know. Okay, John?
Thank you very much, Mike.